The Magic Rose. An aged Breton couple had 2 sons, the elder of whom went to Paris to seek his fortune, while the younger one was timid by nature, and would not leave the parental roof. His mother, who felt the burden of her age, wished the stay-at-home to marry. At first he would not hear of the idea, but at last, persuaded by her, he took a wife. He had only been married a few weeks, however, when his young bride sickened and died. Larose, for such was his name, was inconsolable. Every evening he went to the cemetery where his wife was buried, and wept over her tomb. One night he was about to enter the graveyard on his sad errand, when he beheld a terrible phantom standing before him, which asked him in awful tones what he did there. "I am going to pray at the tomb of my wife," replied a terrified Larose. "Do you wish that she were alive again?" asked the spirit. "Ah, yes," cried the sorrowing husband. "There is nothing that I would not do in order that she might be restored to me." "Hearken then," said the phantom. "Return to this place tomorrow night at the same hour. Provide yourself with a pick, and you will see what comes to pass." On the following night, the young widower was punctually at the rendezvous. The phantom presented itself before him and said, "Go to the tomb with your wife, and strike it with your pick. The earth will turn aside, and you will behold her lying in her shroud. Take this little silver box, which contains a rose. Open it, and pass it before her nostrils 3 times, when she will awake, as if from a deep sleep." Larose hastened to the tomb of his wife, and everything happened as the phantom had predicted. He placed the box containing the rose to his wife's nostrils, and she awoke with a sigh, saying, I have been asleep for a long time." The husband provided her with clothes, which he had brought with him, and they returned to their house, much to the joy of his parents. Some time afterward, Larose's father died at a great age, and the grief-stricken mother was not long in following him to the grave. Larose wrote to his brother in Paris to return to Brittany in order to receive his portion of the parental inheritance, but he was unable to leave the capital, so Larose had perforce to journey to Paris. He promised his wife before leaving that he would write to her every day, but on his arrival in the city he found his brother very ill, and in the anxiety of nursing him back to health, he quite forgot to send his wife news of how he fared. The weeks passed, and Larose's wife, without word of her husband, began to dread that something untoward had happened to him. Day by day she sat at her window weeping and watching for the courier who brought letters from Paris. A regiment of dragoons chanced to be billeted in the town, and the captain, who lodged at the inn directly opposite Larose's house, was greatly attracted by the young wife. He inquired of the landlady who was the beautiful dame who sat constantly weeping at her window, and learned the details of her history. He wrote a letter purporting to come from Larose's brother in Paris, telling her that her husband had died in the capital, and some time after paid his addresses to the supposed widow, who accepted him. They were married, and when the regiment left the town the newly wedded pair accompanied it. Meanwhile, Larose's brother recovered from his illness, and the eager husband hastened back to Brittany. But when he arrived at his home, he was surprised to find the doors closed, and was speedily informed of what had occurred during his absence. For a while he was too grief-stricken to act, but, recovering himself somewhat, he resolved to enlist in the regiment of dragoons, in which the false captain held his commission. The beauty of his handwriting procured him the post of secretary to one of the lieutenants, but although he frequently attempted to gain sight of his wife, he never succeeded in doing so. One day the captain entered the lieutenant's office, observed the writing of Larose, and asked his brother officer if he would kindly lend him his secretary for a few days, to assist him with some correspondence. While helping the captain, Larose beheld his wife, who did not, however, recognize him. Greatly pleased with his work, the captain invited him to dinner. During the repast, a servant, who had stolen a silver dish, fearing that it was about to be missed, slid it into Larose's pocket, and when it could not be found, accused the secretary of theft. Larose was brought up before a court-martial, which condemned him to be shot. While in prison awaiting his execution, Larose struck up an acquaintance with an old veteran named Père Lachaise, who brought him his meals, and seemed kindly disposed to him. "Père Lachaise," said Larose one day, "I have 2,000 francs. If you do as I ask, they shall be yours." The veteran promised instantly, and Larose requested that after he was shot, Lachaise should go to the cemetery where he was buried, and resuscitate him with the magic rose, which he had carefully preserved. On the appointed day, Larose was duly executed, but Père Lachaise, with his pockets full of money, went from inn to inn, drinking and making merry. Whenever the thought of Larose crossed his mind, he muttered to himself in bibulous accents, "Poor fellow, poor fellow! He is better dead. This is a weary world. Why should I bring him back to it?" When Père Lachaise had caroused with his comrades for some days, the 2,000 francs had almost disappeared. Then remorse assailed him, and he made up his mind to do as Larose had wished. Taking a pick and an axe, he went to the graveyard. But when he struck the grave with his tools and the earth rolled back, disclosing the body of Larose, the old fellow was so terrified that he ran helter-skelter from the spot. A draught of good wine brought back his failing courage, however, and he returned, and passed the rose 3 times under the nostrils of his late acquaintance. Instantly Larose sat up. "By my faith, I've had a good sleep," he said, rubbing his eyes. "Where are my clothes?" Père Lachaise handed him his garments, and after he had donned them, they quitted the graveyard with all haste. Larose now found it necessary to cast about for a living. One day he heard the sound of a drum in the street, and, following it, found that it was beaten by a crier, who promised in the king's name a large reward to those who would enlist as sentinels to guard a chapel where the king's daughter, who had been changed into a monster, was imprisoned. Larose accepted the offer, and then learned, to his dismay, that the sentinel who guarded the palace between the hours of 11 and midnight was never seen again. On the very first night that he took up his duties, this perilous watch fell to his lot. He felt his courage deserting him, and he was about to fly when he heard a voice say, "Larose, where are you?" Larose trembled. What do you wish with me?" he asked. "Hearken to me, and no evil will befall you," replied the voice. "Soon a great and grisly beast will appear. Leave your musket by the side of the sentry-box, climb on top, and the beast will not touch you." As 11 o'clock struck, Larose heard a noise, and hastened to climb to the top of the sentry-box. Soon a hideous monster came out of the chapel, breathing flames and crying, "Sentinel of my father, where art thou, that I may devour thee?" As it uttered these words, it fell against the musket, which it seized between its teeth. The creature disappeared into the chapel, and Larose descended from his perch. He found the musket broken into 1,000 pieces. The old king was delighted to learn that his sentinel had not been devoured, for in order that his daughter should be delivered from her enchantment as a beast, it was necessary that the same sentinel should mount guard for 3 consecutive nights, between the hours of 11 and midnight. On the following night, Larose was pacing up and down on guard, when the same voice addressed him, telling him on this occasion to place his musket before the door of the chapel. The beast issued as before, seized the musket, broke it into small pieces, and returned to the chapel. On the 3rd night, the voice advised him to throw open the door of the chapel, and when the beast came out, to run into the building himself, where he would see a leaden shrine, behind which he could take refuge, and where he would find a small bottle, with the contents of which he was to sprinkle the beast's head. With its usual dreadful roar, the monster issued from the chapel. Larose leapt past it and ran for the leaden shrine. It followed him with hideous howls, and he only reached the protective sanctuary in time. Seizing the little bottle which lay there, he fearlessly fronted the beast and sprinkled its contents over its head. Instantly it changed into a beautiful princess, whom Larose escorted to her delighted parents. Larose and the princess were betrothed and duly married, and shortly afterward the king gave up his throne to his son-in-law. One day the new king was inspecting the regiment of dragoons to which he had once belonged. "Colonel," he said, "I miss a man from your regiment." "It is true, sire," replied the colonel. "It is an old fellow called Père Lachaise, whom we had left at the barracks playing his violin. The old good-for-nothing. I wish to see him," said the king. Père Lachaise was brought forward, trembling, and the king, tearing the epaulettes from the shoulders of the captain who had stolen his wife, placed them on those of Père Lachaise. He then gave orders for a great fire to be lit, in which were burned the wicked captain and the wife who had so soon forgotten her husband. Larose and his queen lived happily ever afterward, which is rather odd, is it not, when one thinks of the treatment meted out to his resuscitated spouse? But if the lights in folk-tale are bright, the shadows are correspondingly heavy, and rarely does justice go hand in hand with mercy in legend.